So the format of our panel will consist of some brief introductions to our topic area by our panelists, followed by some questions by me, which I hope will properly set the stage for us to have a larger discussion with anyone who is interested in engaging with what we're talking about. And I would ask also, is this being recorded?
It can be if you have permission from the panelists.
Yes.
I didn't see all of the panelists come out, so it did not record, but
Okay.
if you have permission from all of your panelists.
Yeah.
Permission granted?
Yes.
Permission granted, as it?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
So it's going to give you a lot of words. I guess.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay. So our panel today will focus on digital diaspora and its discontents. So while we're each in different stages of our work, through some prior conversation, we identified a lot of common threads across the mediatization of diaspora and social media spaces. Sorry. What we are interested in examining is how digital platform affordances and network structures serve as mechanisms for the construction of national and ethnic identities and set the parameters for political engagement. As group identification and real-time determination of group membership have become sources of value for social networking services, ethnicization, ethnicity, race, identification has become vital to the contestation of national and global politics. This panel offers some evidence from across social networking services such as Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, to examine the ways in which nations and diasporas are produced, specifically in response to a perceived threat to the nation or to national identity. We will examine the commonalities across and between the Ethiopian, Lebanese, and American political contexts. Across these contexts, that diasporic communities are discursively produced to gain legitimacy and support for national and ethnic struggles, from civil war to economic collapse to justice claims. I will leave that summary there for now and take a moment to just introduce my co-panelists. I am joined today, first seated here with me in the room is the newly christened Dr. Heather Jabber who is an incoming assistant professor in digital culture, digital culture, sorry, at Northwestern University, Qatar Department of Communication. I will also be joined here on Zoom by the soon-to-be Dr. Azeb Madebo, who will be defending her dissertation very soon. So anticipatory congratulations to her on what I know of in defense. Azeb is an incoming professor of critical media studies at the University of Portland in the state of Oregon in the United States. And those are our panelists. As I said, those are our only two for today, along with myself. So I would like to begin by offering both of our panelists the opportunity to introduce some of their research and some of what they've been working on. And then we'll move into a Q&A format with myself, where they will be responding to a few questions that I've prepared, and then hopefully if we have any engagement from the audience, we'll be able to respond to you. So we will start with Heather. Dr. Jabber.
Your audio, Diami, was a bit muffled for me.
Okay, sorry, it might be my
Maybe distancing from the mic or something.
How's this? Does this sound okay?
Yes.
All right, so that's visible to everyone. Azeb, can you see that? Oh,
I can see you. It's window.
I'll just share this.
You know what? I click on the bigger arrow. Presentation. Do you have any videos in the presentation?
No. Okay. Great. Okay. So thank you for the introduction, Diami. Excited to talk to you all about some of the work that I've been doing. So before I got into the case study that is relevant to this panel, I wanted to just briefly talk about what my research focuses on. I'm studying something I'm calling the digital bahdali. And the word bahdali is a word in Arabic, actually colloquial Arabic that, okay. Apologies here. Right. I can just, yeah, I don't know how to do it on here, but I can just get my notes.
Yeah, if you want to do that, I think that's going to be the fastest setup since.
Right, right.
Okay.
Okay. So let's just get this. All right. Right. So I'm studying what I'm calling the digital bahdali, which is the Arabic word for humiliation or a moment of ridicule. And I'm studying this in the context of the post-revolution in both Egypt and Lebanon, when both countries have had a lot of sort of meta-narratives around whether their revolutions have failed. And so digital bahdali has been a way of understanding what it means to lose access to an imagined cosmopolitanism or national exceptionalism that was once offered to national subjects or part of their everyday living. So for me, bahdali is both a word that people use to describe this moment of ridicule, but it's also something that I've been seeing online. Moments when national officials would be shamed or ridiculed or made jokes about them, and their standing is sort of circulates as a public joke. So I was really interested in how people are using the bahdali to reaffirm sort of slighted nationalisms, which brought me to a group called This Is Lebanon, which is an activist group that works to combat abuse and violence in the kafala system in Lebanon. And the kafala system in Lebanon is a migrant worker sponsorship system, and essentially it is when a migrant worker will come from a country, usually from South Asia or East Africa and Lebanon. It exists in some form in the Gulf as well, but the difference in Lebanon is that there's a relative lack of role of the state in regulating the rights and protections. So really what we see in Lebanon is that private citizens and companies have a large jurisdiction over the treatment of migrant workers, while the state sort of recedes into the background. And so through their work, a particular kind of social mobility is attained or is produced and maintained for a class of Lebanese that is, benefiting, and the state as well benefiting from their labor. So it can be thought of as both a form of, it's been traced along two different genealogies. In the Gulf, when British colonial contracts were made for pearl divers, so a colonial sort of genealogy there, and in Lebanon as a gendered and class system where women in rural areas would migrate to urban areas to wealthier homes. And likely it's a mix of both. And then how it stands today is that since the 1970s, it started to evolve into a system where foreign laborers from South Asia and East Africa began migrating and helping to sort of maintain national structures through the labor of transnational others. So I wanted to just show this slide because it gets at the entire industry and talks about who benefits from this migrant labor. And while there's no real estimate here of how much money is going to the worker, it's definitely a lot less than what is being made by Lebanese employers, both in the private and public sector. And so the amount of money that has been made has been of these private and public sectors has been estimated at 105.6 million in 2019, and of that, very little goes to the actual workers. So in Lebanon, kafala must be understood as part of is filling the gap left by a lack of state social services, but also part of the maintenance of the state through the exploitation of this labor. So this is where I come to This is Lebanon. This is the group that I am focusing on, one chapter of my dissertation study project. And This is Lebanon is a group made of more than now, I think, than 9, but a few relatively anonymous members from around the world, some who were migrant workers, and some who are sort of just volunteering with them. Okay, they use the internet to name and shame, is what it's been called, and expose employers who are abusing or mistreating their workers. So they begin using platforms like WhatsApp and Facebook to threaten employers with exposure online, that they're not paying their workers, that they're violating them. And what they're really trying to do is upset this cosmopolitan imaginary of what Lebanon is by contrasting it with this retrograde and regressive system, as it's been called. So I just wanted to, I'll just mention my 3 findings of my project and then give it back over to maybe Azeb or Diami. This will come up in the questions. So the 3 things I'm looking at are how they use this imaginary of both platforms and cosmopolitanism to meet their demands, how they work through the threat of shame or paranoia to sustain this as a way of meeting demands for informal extra state justice, and then what that paranoia, which they're helping to produce to meet their demands, how it relies on the performances of migrant workers to perform the right kind of suffering. So the sort of relational labor there in forms of justice making that happen online. And with that, I will switch it over and talk to you in the Q&A. There you
go. Thank you very much, Heather. We'll now switch over to Azeb, who can give a brief overview of her project.
Hi, everybody. My name is Azeb. The project that I'm working on that relates directly to this panel is actually one chapter in my dissertation, and I think it makes sense if I speak a bit more broadly about what my dissertation is about first. In my dissertation, I'm primarily concerned with looking at how Ethiopians, both within Ethiopia and outside of the state, so diaspora Ethiopians, go about trying to influence the future direction of the country, what kinds of future possibilities they imagine for the country, and how that is related to the developmental or economic needs that the country is facing. So through this process, I've looked at things like development agendas by the developmental state of Ethiopia, which offers a particular narrative and a particular idea about what kind of future the country should pursue, what nationalism means, right? Who constitutes the nation? And I start with I start to consider the history of Ethiopia from around the 1990s, early 1990s, because that's when a big political shift happened in how the country was demarcated, the constitutional frameworks, the politics. So around the 1990s, Ethiopia embarked on the use of ethnic federalism and ethno-national politics as a way to manage difference in the country, right? So let me share a screen, actually, Diamu. suggested share screen. So I'm going to give a quick visual representation of what that means for how the country ended up being demarcated, right? So this is the capital city of Addis Ababa, and so then each state is named after the major ethnic group living in that state. And those ethnic groups or politicians coming from those ethnic groups, police officers and whatnot, end up controlling those territories and determining the policies and whatnot. But this creates conflict because a lot of smaller, right, ethnic groups with smaller population sizes or like more minoritized populations end up facing the brunt of violence whenever there is contestation over land resources and politics, right? So this is really what's at stake right now in Ethiopian national politics is the question of whether Ethiopia is made up of distinct groups of people, distinct groups of ethnic, right, peoples who come together and form this singular, right, or the state of Ethiopia, or whether Ethiopia can even be said to constitute a nation, right? So I look at how the developmental state has deployed ethnicity and nationhood in order to justify its rule. And then in another one of my chapters, I use digital ethnographic methods and fieldwork within Ethiopia that lasted about 8 months to consider how local populations are debating and negotiating these tensions between nationhood and ethnic, like civic nationhood and ethnic nationhood, right? And what that does to their abilities to work and live in these different regions, what that does in terms of how they can identify with one another, where they can work, what languages they can, their pursuit, pressure to speak in different parts of the country. So everything is contested, right? So everything in that context is contested, including the flag, the languages, the cultural formations like food, to the media landscape, right? But the chapter that's more directly relevant to this panel is really focused on the diaspora and how the diaspora is able to deploy digital media tools to be engaged in the politics of their homeland, right? So whether they're associating themselves or affiliated with more ethno-national perspectives or are supporting the state itself or the government or uphold more Ethiopianist frameworks, they're able to deploy digital media to take an active role in influencing the future of the country and the policies and the decisions that are being made by the government, right? So that's the particular chapter that I'll be discussing in our Q&A sections. Should I say anything else, Diami?
Thank you. I think we'll tease out the rest in the Q&A. Thank you very much, Azeb. So I am the chair of this panel, so I wasn't really going to talk too much about my own research. However, because we lost a panelist, I am going to talk about the issue that was related to that panelist and also connects to my own work. So my research concerns reparations and specifically the discourse that emerges online around reparations for slavery in the United States in particular. Reparations has become a popular concept in Black politics in particular, but has increasingly become a frame for understanding redistributive justice in the United States and elsewhere. Many had their first encounter with it via Ta-Nehisi Coates' popular article, The Case for Reparations, a few years ago, but obviously the reparations discourse has been long-standing and has been going on for over a century. So it's been steadily gaining ground recently. It's been popularized, you could say, as an example of this. The Democratic Party in its 2020 platform included a call for reparations, or at least to pursue reparations, despite the fact that there hasn't been a ton of movement on that. So we've seen this discussed in a number of articles, and also in popular press, particularly emerging out of some of the discourse that came through the 1619 project that the New York Times published. And but it has become an extremely important discourse within what we may conceptualize as the Black public sphere. And the Black public sphere we can define here as the sort of agglomeration of discourse related to the political and cultural stakes of Blackness as a form of identification. That's a sort of truncated definition. One of the things that I would argue is that one of the reasons the reparations discourse has taken off so much is because the loudest proponents of it are members of a what I'm conceiving as an ideological group or a discourse community called ADOS, which stands for the American Descendants of Slavery. There is a formal organization by that name, which is run by two YouTube political influencers. But I am more interested in the ideological network and more particularly the discourse communities as they attempt to influence potential reparations policy, such as what we're seeing in the state of California in the United States. So my work deals with what I'm provisionally calling the sort of debt and descent ideology, which attempts to link the present racial wealth gap in our societies to a particular debt that is owed to particular subgroups of people. In the American Descendants of Slavery discourse, this emerges as the so-called native Black people who have been the descendants of those who were enslaved specifically in the United States. I style this as a form of, as a sort of conservative form of Black nationalism that harkens back to earlier articulations of that concept. Oftentimes when we think of Black nationalism, we think of the recent versions of it that we saw in the 1970s from the Black Power. But there is an older Black nationalism that calls back to the idea of recognizing a Black nation in the United States and wanting to divert resources to that nation of people, and specifically for the purpose of better assimilation into the fabric of America or the American dream. So I think I will stop right there, other than to say one other thing, which is maybe my axe to grind. So recently, one of the things about the ADOS group is that they work very tightly together in forms of networked political contestation. And I was a part of a project doing a little bit of background research on them that ended up resulting in a paper called Disinformation Creep. As you can see here, it was retracted. And this paper details in the Harvard Misinformation Review some of the use of breaking news that ADOS employed to discuss their reparations agenda and their what I would call anti-migrant discourse. So this paper was submitted and subjected to peer review. It was accepted, and ADOS launched a campaign to discredit it, which was ultimately successful. If you can see in the retraction notes here, there were concerns that were brought challenging the validity of the findings. So it was subjected to an extraordinary secondary review, and it says here that there were unsubstantiated conclusions drawn from the analysis by an external independent review. But I would argue that the primary cause of this paper's retraction was in fact the pressure that was exerted by ADOS who worked across social media, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, to ensure that at any cost this paper would in fact be taken down, something we referred to as the Crimson Smear, and which is now being celebrated as it has been, as they were successful. So I'm going to leave it there. And I will go into our Q&A, which we don't have a ton of time for, but I'll make it quick.
Should we talk from here?
Okay. So I'm going to truncate some of these questions because we have limited time, it seems. But I would like to at least ask one of these questions to you, Heather, individually, and then also to you, Azeb, and then we'll have a couple questions that you both can take turns answering.
Okay.
All right. So, Heather, you in your work on Lebanon, you've dealt with a system in which, and by this system I mean in the nation of Lebanon itself, when the contours of accessing resources are mediated by ethnicity, in fact, or by sect, we might say. And this has been a situation that's complicated by the material scarcity brought on by the recent economic collapse there. So can you talk a little bit about how ethnicity mediates how people engage with traditional media and digital media, and what has been different in particular, if anything, about the aggregating function of social media, where people must simply be Lebanese or Middle Eastern when they speak to the world, especially when talking back home, talking about issues back home as part of a sort of network diaspora.
Yeah, so I would say that the marked difference between the way that people engage with media, traditional media, has been that shift away from articulations of media as sectarian and towards a more nationalist articulation or performance of nationalism online. So I would say, you know, in Lebanon, each political party, of which there are several, owns a television network, and whether it's them owning it directly or through, you know, business buddies, owns a terrestrial television network and sort of, you know, that sort of chose their party line. And so a lot of people will engage with many different channels to get a sense of what's happening within the country, sort of doing a scan of that. But still these things do articulate as sectarian. Okay, this person said that because this was on this network. And then online, what I noticed, especially with This Is Lebanon, this group that's extra national, that's anonymous, that takes on this sort of deterrestrial, you know, function, or appears to, is the way that people engage as nationals online. So as This Is Lebanon invokes Lebanon, people respond as Lebanese people who are either, you know, ashamed of what they're seeing, or ashamed of it and sort of usher it in and say, yes, we're ashamed of how we look to other people, or reject it and sort of say, we're not that bad, you know, we're just like other countries that have exploitation of labor and violence and all these things. But the important thing there is this imaginary of the world that is part of what is what platforms are built upon, because as people come to them, especially in these case studies, which I'm really interested in the transnational for that reason, they do come to these platforms with an awareness or an imaginary of other nationals, of other places of the world looking on. So I think in this project, there's been a sort of nationalist paranoia that's kind of come out of these spaces online, that isn't quite the same with traditional media, where you would have much more suspicion of sect along sectarian lines. So that's what I would say the biggest shift would be, moving to the digital sphere.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you. As a sort of on a related note, so you briefly discussed the ethnic federal system in Ethiopia and the divisions along ethnic lines, but one thing that, of course, is crucial to note is that this recently sparked into open war. So I wanted to ask you specifically about that. So one of the concepts that we're discussing more broadly in our work is sort of these diaspora wars in media, which in part are about self-proclaimed members of groups policing the boundaries of their group identification for a variety of reasons. So in the case of your study, the discourse of diaspora war overlapped with actual material war. So what did your study uncover about the role of this ethnic boundary setting in making the case for or intensifying military conflict? And further, what might we be missing about how media affordances map onto these practices?
Okay, sorry for the background noise. First off, I'm kind of in a public area. One thing I did want to touch on based on what Heather was saying was that I think like in terms of like whether media help aggregate conceptions of like the nation, in the Ethiopian context, I think it's different in that digital media are allowing people to actually have disaggregated identifications with nationhood and like ethnic nationhood as well as like civic or Ethiopian nationhood, because unlike ethnic categories or people's beings of ethnicity, like you can't really tell apart different Ethiopians from each other most of the time and say, oh, you're this ethnic group or that, right? Because there's so much shared between different groups of people from different regions, cultural practices, names, right? There's a lot of similarities, right? So what digital media has actually allowed is for people to kind of distinguish themselves as groups or create like distinct categories or groupings by using like visual iconographies and like images, emojis, color schemes, right? So different groups would have different color schemes that they use. So then that creates very identifiable markers for who is who or who's belonging to or claiming membership into particular groups, right? So I think digital media are actually in some ways exacerbating the divisions and the ethnicized contestations, because they're offering another way or like these visual tools for creating distinct expressions or distinct identifications with national politics, which might not really exist in in the people's like lived realities on the ground. And then when it comes to the question of role of ethnic boundary studying in intensifying the war, first I would say that like most Ethiopians that I've spoken to or know of actually want the war to end, right? Like most people are not happy with the war, but the issue is that because it is ethnicized, and because a lot of people's grievances are felt and experienced and explained through ethnic frameworks, it's really hard for people to come to a solution or any political movement that's really based on solidarity across multiple groupings of ethnicity or religion, right? So in Ethiopia, like the contestations are not only over ethnic groups, right? Like the Oromo, the Amhara, the Tigrayans. It's also between Muslims and Christians, and so it's also religious. So a lot of cultural practices and formations are ethnicized. So the difficulty is that because everything is ethnicized and people understand these grievances and these conflicts through an ethnic lens, and because these contestations are fought through ethnicized conflicts where like groups of people get killed because of their identity or their religious affiliation or something like that, people have deep-seated frustrations and traumas that because of this, right? So the war intensifies, right? Because depending on who wins, the political outcome of the country will be very different, right? So if you have ethno-nationalist groups winning, the ethnification of the country can get worse, right? These conflicts can get worse in this way from the perspective of more Ethiopian nationalists. If Ethiopian nationalists win, then from the perspective of ethno-nationalists, you'll have a unitary state, right? These ethnic groups will lose the ability to self-administer and self-determine themselves, right? Govern themselves in their ethnic states and zones, right? Use their own languages and things like that. So the conflict is really made to be about identity, and so the people who have the most to gain, who are like the ethnic clientelist politicians and ethnic parties, can really deploy people's frustrations and feelings and experiences to continue this war, right? Because like the solution, it's really impossible, I think, for the average Ethiopian to find a solution, because they're experiencing this as like, for instance, like ethnic Tigrayans I've talked to are experiencing this as a genocide, and they really do believe that the state and other people in Ethiopia are trying to extinct them, right, or get rid of them. And so this becomes a matter of survival, or they see it as a matter of survival for their people, which then just makes it really impossible to find political solutions, because the issue is not really seen as political, right? There's a lot of emotions and frustrations and affect that are driving this conflict. I don't know if that kind of answers your question, Diami.
Yeah, no, it does. Thank you very much. So we're running short on time, and so I just want to ask a question to both of you. I think building off of some of the points that you've already raised, maybe. So this is a sort of combination question of the last thing that I wanted to ask, which is one is the first part of it is what should research agendas take into account when thinking about the way ethnicity and nationalism is performed online, and also what are the stakes of ignoring contexts that are outside of what we might call the quote-unquote mainstream, or the U.S. or the global North, or the West. So in other words, people may dismiss some of these squabbles as only relevant to the groups that they concern, the Ethiopian context or the Lebanese context, or certainly in my own case, Black politics is criminally misunderstood and ignored in a lot of mainstream American politics. So what might the field of communication miss by thinking that this is just a sort of ethnic squabble or ethnic tensions or sectarian problems, or writing it off as that? And how might we trouble this notion of the in-group when studying online politics and the way things converge? So Heather, do you want to?
Sure, yeah. I think to be quick and to kind of hit both of those, I think it's important to recognize the role of the nation in shaping, like as an important framework for understanding digital media platforms. First of all, recognizing what is sort of implied and what is being performed, but recognizing that in a relational sense. So taking, the case of Lebanon, and imaginaries of Lebanon as this multicultural haven where women are so much more progressive and free than other parts of the region. Like, what is being implied there, and what is being obscured there? What's being obscured is the labor of migrant domestic workers who really create the means for women to be able to have careers, to have families and work, to live certain kinds of lifestyles. So understanding relationally across nations, like what helps create these imaginaries and sustain them and make them these aspirational ways of being, right? And so the stakes of ignoring that are that we reconstruct the nation as these containers, that these natural containers, and sort of silo them off from each other instead of thinking about transnational, like the issues we're talking about: economic collapse, climate change, migration. None of them recognize national borders and sort of stop at them. So we have to think across them and think about, I would say, take a more relational approach to questions of digital media writ large, whether you're thinking about nations or other ways of modes of identification like ethnicity, sectarianism, those sorts of things.
Thank you.
Mhm.
And certainly, digital media itself is not constrained to national borders to
Right, exactly.
to pull on your concept. So,
Right.
Azeb?
Yes. One thing my mind goes to with this question is an interview I had with a participant, where this participant was explaining to me the cases of national and ethnic protests, and campaigns and movements that were taking shape online, and how she saw these as being like ways of branding and creating and constructing identities of these distinct groups of people, right? And she interestingly said to me that this is partially a result of Ethiopians borrowing from Ethiopians in the diaspora who come from Ethiopia, borrowing from Western frameworks for organizing. So single identity based, right? Like she was listing things like Black Lives Matter, right? So focused on race and Blackness, or Me Too movement focused on gender and single, certain conceptions of what it means to be a woman. So she was saying that she thinks that the way that the diaspora is organizing around ethnicity, right? So advocating for particular ethnic groups based on their identification with those ethnic groups is a consequence of them like encountering these forms of mobilization in the West, right? And this was actually, I thought it was very, intriguing analysis that she was making, because I saw that playing out often during my observations, where people often tried to make sense of what was going on in Ethiopia through frameworks like Black Lives Matter, right? So how people make sense of oppression often borrows language, right, from these campaigns or protests that are happening in the Western context, nationalist discourse that's happening in the Western context, to then justify or make sense of what's going on in Ethiopia. And this really obscures some of the interconnections and like more fluid relationships that exist within Ethiopia, because it focuses on single, because it's a monoracial country, right? I mean, there are variations in skin tone and whatnot, but it's not a country of different racial groups, right? So then these politics and frameworks from the West are then applied there to create very differentiated and distinct movements based on distinct, right, quote unquote, groups of people that are ethnicized. So there are direct relationships, and I think that the Ethiopian context could be really a case to understand what happens when ethnicity becomes the way people organize, right? Like it's an extreme case, really, and the political conflicts are an extreme case and evidence of this. So I think it could be a warning, right, as much as a reflection of what happens when you take what's happening in the Western context and apply it to places where difference is experienced in different ways, right? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's a lot of interesting points you made specifically about the migration of Western discourses elsewhere and how they're sort of mapped on to the politics that are local to a region. I'm going to step back over to the podium to just see if there's any questions in the chat.
We don't have any questions.
No questions.
All right. Okay, so if you did have any questions, speak now or forever hold your peace. But I would just like to say, bridging off of something that Zeb just said, one of the issues in my own work is that the notion of Black Twitter, for example, has become a sort of popular frame to understand how people use the identification of Blackness online to mobilize, to connect, etc. But the ADOS is something that sort of troubles that notion because it points to sort of these distinctions that have existed within communities, and it sort of points to the fraught nature of the idea of an organic Black community existing in the first place. This when it is mapped onto social media discourse, it often people are forced to rely on the affordance structure to sort of signal that I am a part of this group, I am a part of that group. In the case of ADOS, they use American flag iconography to identify across social media, just as I mentioned about the groups in the Ethiopian context who do some similar things. So we need to be attentive to the fact that there are no monolithic entities. There is no monolithic Ethiopia online. There is no monolithic Lebanon online. There is no monolithic Black Twitter that we can say, but it is a spectrum of and points of view. So I hope that this panel has been interesting for those of you who were able to watch and somewhat informative. We certainly look forward to engaging with you in the future. I would say that my colleagues can put their contact information in the chat, maybe, because their contact information is changing. But if you'd like to reach us, at least for now, to go to those dreaded social networks, said Heather, yours is
Heather Jabber.
Heather Jabber,
Yep.
at Heather Jabber, at Azegmanivo, right? For real?
Gmail is fine.
Oh, well, at Gmail, right? And I'm at the Diverge on Twitter, or DM me at edu. So thank you for taking part today.
The recording has stopped.
Thank you.